Welcome to Shift, the college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Cassandra with Achievable, and if you're a parent trying to help your student prepare for the ACT, SAT, or CLT without the stress, the sales pressure, or the four-figure price tag, Achievable was built for you. Our courses help students study smarter, stay motivated, and actually retain what they learn, all in a flexible format that fits real family schedules. You can try Achievable free at achievable.me, and if it's a good fit, use the code podcast for 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we have Kathy Hart with us, and Kathy, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, Cassandra. As you said, my name is Kathy Hart. I'm an independent educational consultant with JRA Educational Consulting. We are part of the Score at the Top Learning Centers and Schools family, in essence, a Florida-based company. And I have been with my company for 13 years. And in addition to advising students on the college application process, I am also a test prep instructor and working primarily with students on the SAT and ACT verbal sections.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining. Today we are talking about why some high achievers underperform on standardized
Mhm.
tests. And I think this is a really common thing that happens and it can be a bit confusing. So we want to kind of dive into the depths of it. And to start things off, what are maybe some common misconceptions that, you know, good students that get really good grades, have a high GPA, why do they think that, oh, is it like overconfidence? Is it just what is it that makes them be like, I got this on the standardized test, and then they come out of it and they're really shocked at the results?
Yeah, and that's a great question and a great starting point. And of course, it'll vary with every student. Sometimes these high achieving students are very busy young adults in addition to looking at their SAT, ACT, CLT for colleges. They're in a rigorous high school curriculum. They are heavily involved in extracurricular activities, and all of these take a lot of their time. So sometimes that can be a little surprising when they go into a standardized test that in essence is available for every student, and they come away with thinking, oh my gosh, that was harder than I thought. And sometimes it can just be a matter of maybe it's been a while since they've taken a standardized test. Some students will pop in their ninth, 10th grade, sometimes even junior year and sit for the PSAT, but that's maybe been the only exposure they've had to a true timed standardized test. So some of it can be just a matter of there's a lot going on. They might be functioning on very little sleep. And certainly we can talk about some of the self-care and preparation that can be a great tool for helping any student, and especially our high achievers, help them do well there. And yeah, and then I would also say that just not being familiar with the tests, because they are used to when they're sitting in their AP calculus class or their AP Lang class, the assessments that they're receiving, the course materials that they are studying are very detailed and very narrowly focused. And here they're going in and they are taking a test that's pretty broad. And another piece, and we can also explore this as well, is sometimes the test is asking questions from concepts, ideas, items that they haven't thought about since maybe middle school. So I think that can be some of the factors, and also sometimes timing issues as well too, which I think is another strategy that's helpful in managing those standardized tests.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think it is a bit unfamiliar because
Mhm.
that's not really the structure in school. And so it's having to really understand this different way of taking a test.
Mhm.
And I think too, with these types of students, and again, yes, it's going to vary by each individual, but do you think there's maybe like a sense of perfectionism that maybe hurts them while they're taking these tests? Do you think that's more relevant for high achievers than for, the average student?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I 100% agree. And I think it can play into two ways. I think in terms sometimes like being the perfectionist, sometimes there can be a little bit of that feeling intimidated, feeling that the stakes are so high, and sometimes
Mhm.
that can not harm a student or hurt a student, but might make them overthink the test or second guess themselves. So there certainly can be that piece that they might talk themselves out of doing well, or not consciously, but feeling that sense of intimidation. Also, too, going back to the timing of the test, is these tests are very much not only testing knowledge, but also testing time management. And sometimes, if I'm a high achieving student and I am very comfortable doing well on exams and being able to answer most questions correctly, and maybe I get stuck on a particularly challenging math question, let's say, or even a reading question that's going into a high level of detail, sometimes then all of a sudden I look up and I realize, oh, wow, I spent so much time on this particular problem because I wanted to get it right. I really wanted to understand it, that, oh my goodness, I'm only have a finite number of minutes remaining to
Right.
complete the remaining questions. So I think it can go in both directions. There is getting a little bit stuck on wanting to answer every question correctly and not realizing that it's okay. You don't have to answer, and not every student is going to answer every question correctly. And then also maybe having some of those nerves set them back. So maybe they get a little bit flummoxed or a little uneasy during one of those tests. And that can also play a role.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, having this mindset of I have to answer each question first. And
Mhm.
second, they all have to be right. There's really this high achieving mindset that does play into the perfectionist idea a lot. And I think it can maybe hurt the performance on tests of that. And so I think there's a lot of mindset that goes into this topic when we're talking about high achievers. Maybe they do have a little more test anxiety because of their mindset, and maybe because they have a fear of failure too, as everyone does, but it's at this other level because they are really attached to this outcome on this exam. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe some other mindset factors that might play a role?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I think a lot of it has to do looking with developing sort of that big picture overview versus that single moment overview when it
Mhm.
comes to the test, and looking at it as part of as a process, a pathway, versus just this one moment and this one test. Because I think that's something, and these are conversations that we have with our students as they're starting to prepare college application, is planning out testing and kind of help developing that mindset that, very few students, I can't think of one off the top of my head, is going to get it right in quotation marks the first time.
Mhm.
A lot of that mindset, or that shift in mindset, just comes from just being, again, it's not just a one and done experience in most instances. Now, obviously, if you're a student who's coming very late to the game, you might only have one opportunity to take an SAT and ACT, but that's not going to be the instance with these students. So it's just that recognition that it's part of the process, and also just the importance of starting early and getting comfortable with the test. And I think that's a lot of it too. Again, for students that, for whom testing has always come easy, and then they sit down for the SAT, the ACT, and realize it was unexpectedly challenging for whatever reason. And we were just discussing some of the reasons why they might have found it challenging. It's okay. Most students are taking their first test in their junior year, sometimes towards the end of their sophomore year. So it's having that time to plan, to get comfortable, to practice. And those students usually are the ones, because they are very self-disciplined. They have those good study skills that they've used for success in their classes, in their high school classes. And then it's a matter of taking that mindset, that willingness to work, and applying it to preparing for a future standardized test. And I think that serves students very well once they remove a little bit of that high stakes mentality and they can say, okay, I've got other opportunities to test. What can I do in the meantime to help me prepare and achieve what I want to achieve on the test?
I think it's interesting because they do have such great study skills
Mhm.
because of where they're at in their academic career right now. I'm curious, do you think that there is maybe less studying going on for these exams because they feel it's not needed? Or do you think they study more because it's even more high stakes?
Yeah, no, honestly, I could say it could go either way. And I think studying for a standardized test will look different than how the student is studying from a classroom test, a classroom exam, because it's less about that deep knowledge and it's more about gaining an understanding of what they could potentially see. Because as every test will have different questions, but will have the overriding topics. Like I know for my any reading questions, in addition to some basic main idea, some vocabulary and context, I'm also going to see some inference based questions. But how those are framed, how those are written could vary from test to test. So yeah, I would say sometimes students would who would maybe feel like, okay, I don't need to study for it. Maybe that would be a good that they've just said, okay, I can just go in. It's a Saturday morning. I'm in all of these very advanced classes. Maybe I don't need to prepare. Maybe for those students after that first test, it may make sense for them to go back. Now let's go through. There's plenty of opportunities to study for the test. There's the actual physical books. You can still do that. We know SAT is on a digital platform and it offers a lot of great free practice tests and question banks for students to help prepare. So I would say that would be a good thing for that student that may have not maybe didn't prepare as much. And then likewise, sometimes those over preparing students, again, they can overthink things a little and they might not need that same depth of studying that they would need to do for, say, a classroom exam, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned a couple of times, right? We're talking about coursework, the different grading systems that go into high school. You have homework, you have extra credit, you're making revisions on things. Do you think that's maybe also contributing to a gap that some of these students might see when they are taking these tests? You made a really good point about how focused class exam is, a test in a class, and it's very specific and it's very narrowed on a specific subject, whereas the SAT, ACT is very broad. And so it's a lot of
Hmm.
knowledge to get down in a short amount of time. So do you think there's any connection with how the schoolwork is graded? Maybe not to go off on a tangent, but is there maybe grade inflation that's occurring that might be contributing to some of these higher GPAs and better grades? And now they take these standardized tests and they're very overwhelmed at the outcome that they see. And then again, it goes back to the mindset and the confidence. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe what connections you think might be there?
Yeah, no, and there certainly is, yeah. And there have been some studies that have, and you'll see those gain headlines from time to time that the average GPA is creeping up, but then the standardized test scores are either flat or going down. And yeah, that can certainly play a role, especially since in a classroom, many times students will get the opportunity to not necessarily to retake an exam, but they can do test corrections, look for ways to get extra credits, and that can also help because it's the grade isn't purely, of course, is there is a numeric factor in grading, but there are also those other factors that go into contributing an overall student's average. And yeah, for a high achieving student, if they get a lower grade on a high school test, of course, if there's an opportunity to either build that score back up again or to do some additional work in the class, that'll contribute to that overall higher classroom average. Of course, those students, they're hard workers and they want to do that. Whereas, yeah, on the SAT, ACT, on a standardized exam, you have that two-ish, 2.5 hours, and you don't get the opportunity to make a correction or to go back and to get some sort of extra credit. So that can certainly be a factor. Also, too, sometimes those fundamentals, because again, the SAT, I mean, I was certainly speaking to like the ACT English, which is a multiple choice writing test, they're going to ask some really basic grammar questions. And they tend to ask it in a way that students have to think. So it isn't just a very simple question
Mhm.
by any stretch, but a lot of time they're testing students on fundamentals that, again, if I'm a high achieving student and I'm in a class where I'm writing a very elaborate research paper, I'm not thinking about comma placement or semicolon use. And maybe I'm using them correctly automatically, but I now when I'm confronted or seeing that as like a test question, it causes me to say, oh my gosh, what is that rule again? Am I using it correctly? Or maybe I was never taught that at some point. Maybe I didn't learn that specifically, or even for math. If I'm a student who's already in calculus as a junior, it's been a long time since I've had the fundamentals of algebra. And then how were those fundamentals taught? And it could be a matter of having to go back and to get and refreshing some of the basics there. Yeah, I think that's certainly some of it. Certainly there can be an element of either, yeah, is it grade inflation, or is it a matter of just the way a class is graded? It's not just a single right or wrong question. There's other components that go into it versus, yeah, on the standardized test, it's a matter of it's yes or no, it's right or wrong, you don't get partial
Right.
credit. So yeah, and then that's a matter of, again, as a student is preparing for a future exam, is with that knowledge in mind, is looking as they're working through practice tests, is identifying, are there any common errors that they're making, and can they learn to correct these errors so when they encounter a similar question on a future live exam, actual exam, that they have that knowledge, either gain that knowledge if they weren't taught it in the first place, or in most instances, that refresh of some of those basic skills that they learned when they were in middle or even elementary school.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and it segues into my next question, which is how often are high achieving students, but just generally speaking too, how often are they relying on memorization when studying for these versus the application of the content? And is that something that's also affecting it? Because memorization, it can come and go, especially when you're
Mhm.
really like prepping for an exam. And a lot of times too, that can also be how they're approaching maybe their classes and different tests they take for those. How is that affecting them on the standardized tests, and what are some ways to maybe improve understanding that application?
That is interesting. Yeah, because if I'm sitting for a history test, I can easily memorize a series of dates, or if I'm writing an essay for an English class about a novel, I can memorize those key points and I know how to bring them out. Whereas, yeah, the standardized tests certainly do have an element of memorization. It's helpful if I know some of the formulas for math, for instance,
Right.
although the SAT does give you a formula sheet. ACT doesn't. So if you're a little rusty on your geometry, you may want to go back and do some of the memorization there. But yeah, it is more application, I would certainly say, and it'll vary. And I think some of again, it really all depends on the student and the type of learner that they are, because I just know from experience when working with students that were high achieving students, were aiming for the scores that they wanted for a certain level of college or scholarship that they might want to get into. It really, again, comes down to the student themselves. And certainly for something that is more rote memorization, if a student is struggling, we're looking at practice tests, we're looking at like a previous test if a student is taking it. And if they just simply don't know a lot of grammar rules, a lot of that is memorization. I always had a list of rules. Always love to teach students dependent and independent clauses, semicolons, colon rules, because a lot of those are rules. A lot of those are formula. You can
Right.
memorize those. But then it's, of course, the repeated practice, right? So making sure that they're getting practice with different tests, because that's one of the things that SAT, ACT is going to do, is even though it might be like a more formulaic rule, like how to use a semicolon, they're going to test it in a number of different ways. Which is part of the test there. But then I would say, because you mentioned like about the application, students that I always found that really enjoyed reading just outside of the classroom, reading for fun, picking up a book on a Saturday afternoon. They always had a very good understanding of just how character was developed. So more of those application skills, like how are we picking up a character's trait through inference, because a lot of that is, it's more subtlety, it's more nuance. And sometimes a student, high achieving or not, if they really love some of that learning for the sake of learning outside of the classroom, that isn't just, okay, I have to learn XYZ in order to pass my Friday morning test, that those students tend to do on different sections of the test. And again, it can vary. I would definitely say it can vary, because some pieces of the SAT, ACT, yeah, those memorization skills, reteaching some of those rules, those formulas, wonderful. That's really going to serve those students well. And then others, just the comfort with reading a history text followed by a literary narrative text followed by a science-based text. Sometimes that's the students that can apply that skill are already doing that in general. So I'll put in a plug for reading for fun, reading for pleasure. I think is a
Yes.
lost skill. I mean, for better or for worse in today's world, but I think it's a good one to tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. And such a good point. And it really does help you build a lot of these skills almost subconsciously. Like the
Mm-hmm.
more you read, the more you just have this knowledge within you, and you might not even know it. But like you said, you're reading different types of text and you can still apply what you know to these different texts. And I think that's really important and such a huge skill to have, especially on these types of exams we're talking about. And then the next thing I wanted to jump into is talking about the emotional response, both during the test and then after the test, and how some high achievers might be taking the score too personally. And again, this might come back to that perfectionist mindset, but can you talk through both during the exam and maybe strategies they are doing or not doing that
Mm-hmm.
might be affecting that? And then also after, when they see the results and maybe it's not what they wanted.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. I think during the test, and I would even say leading up to the test, it's just going in with that as best as you can. It's normal to be nervous. Everyone is going to be nervous when you're faced with some sort of exam where you feel like you're being put on the spot. And this is where it's what's in the student's control is leading up to the exam, especially say that week out before the exam, is of course we know there are things are out of their control. They may have other commitments in their life, but certainly trying to get as much rest as they can in that week leading up to the exam. Certainly the night before the exam, they are SAT, ACT. What I'm talking about is trying to keep it an early night as best as they can, doing something relaxing, calming, not going out with their friends until 1 or 2 in the morning, and then trying to wake up at 7 to get over to their testing center. Certainly making sure that they have the outfit they're going to wear laid out, making sure their devices are charged. If it's taking a paper-based test, those number 2 pencils are sharpened, and that can provide a sense of calm. So when you're leaving the house at 7:30 in the morning, you're going in with a sense of feeling prepared. You're not nervous. Oh my gosh, I forgot something, something isn't charged, etc. And then during the exam itself, and again, those nerves are normal. That's again just part of life. But yeah, when if you find yourself getting stuck on a question, or you find yourself overthinking it, sometimes there's some of those nice breathing exercises that you can do, or just of taking a few deep breaths, shifting around a little in your seat. You can't get up and walk around the room, but students, just reminding them you can give your shoulders a little shrug and give your neck a little shift, and just some of those just calming movements, motions, just to bring yourself back to the test, take a breath, and to keep moving on. And then in terms of handling maybe results that you're less than satisfied with, again, disappointment is normal. It's fine to feel disappointed. Try not to let it get too much disappointment there. And I would say it's always a good opportunity. I always say take a day or two. It's just like when students may not get a decision from a college that they really wanted to have a favorable outcome. And it's okay, you're going to feel disappointed. Take a little bit of time to work through that and process through that, and then think about, okay, what are my next steps? So if I am a student just getting started on my SAT, ACT, CLT testing pathway, good. Now I have time. Almost looking at this as now I have some actual information. I know what the test is like. What can I do to prepare for it in the future? And then thinking back, okay, maybe should be doing some prep leading up to this. Maybe I noticed when I was taking that reading test, I was really struggling with some vocabulary and context. What are some things I can do to build those vocabulary skills? And just really getting that opportunity to do a little bit of self-assessment. Don't beat yourself up. Like, it's okay. This is part of life. Setbacks are an important part of life. And it's what, I mean, they ultimately make us stronger in the end if we can use them to our advantage, use them to just take a moment to that piece of self-knowledge. What can I do? What can I do next? What can I do better? Where did I find myself having difficulty? And then preparing for the next test, assuming that the student will be continuing to test. So I think the mindset, yeah, it's normal. It's okay to feel disappointment. And many of these students, certainly they're used to getting 100% on the test or whatever that looks like for them. And yeah, this is just it's a different type of assessment. It in requires, as we were talking about earlier, some different skills, that broader application. And now that the student knows that, for any future tests that they're going to take, they do now have time to prepare, and they go in with a little bit more knowledge, and they can work from there.
Oh, that's such a good point. I love what you said about treating it as an opportunity, right? And I think that perspective shift is really important and it helps you move forward. And then, like you just said, you have the experience now. Anything that you haven't done before is very unknown. It's
Mhm.
very terrifying. But the minute you do it, after you're like, okay, not as bad as I thought it was gonna be. It makes me think of going on a roller coaster and the
Mm.
anticipation, and you get on and you're like terrified and you're like, oh no. And then by the time it's over, you get off and you're like, that was so fun. I want to go again. Obviously, people aren't wanting to take standardized tests again and again, but it is just facing that fear a little bit, having confidence in yourself that you have prepared and that you know your stuff. And then whatever outcome you get, again, it's an opportunity to determine the next steps for where you need to go and where you want to go. So I think that's such an important part of it too. And again, it comes back to the mindset of it. Um, And then I guess the last thing is, how can parents better support their students, maybe even specifically high achieving students, while they're preparing for these high stakes exams? And do you think that there's anything that parents are doing that might be contributing to maybe some of the pressure as these students are taking these exams?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I certainly would say, especially, as a parent of young adults, and my kids are thankfully they're beyond the SAT and ACT phase, but I remember the stress that they were going through when they were taking those and those tests in high school, in addition to everything else. I think, yeah, as parents, I think it's important that that you are supportive of your student, seeing how you can help them, support them. Do they need on Saturday morning like a quiet space if they're going to do a practice exam? Maybe that Friday night before the exam, helping them find some quiet time just to relax. I would certainly say students, especially high achieving students, are very good at putting the pressure on themselves. They know,
Mhm.
and they're generally surrounded. Their peers are probably of a similar mindset. So they're all very good at putting the pressure on themselves. So I think for parents, it's less about like parents adding any additional pressure. It won't help, quite honestly. And just,
Right.
I think, being more supportive, being when your student is disappointed in a result, not being a good listener, being supportive. What can we do to help? And maybe just a student wants a little time and space if they're not happy with their results, or being their cheerleader when they get what they want. Oh, let's go out for some ice cream, celebrate. Or even if they don't get the results, let's go out for some ice cream and let's forget about this.
Yeah.
Things I think that are important, that especially for, and just speaking again from my parent perspective, and having gone through this, my students having, my kids own kids having gone through this, not me, that was a long time ago, but just being that supportive, nurturing, I think, like safe spot for your student to come to, because again, they're very successful. They know what they want. They are working towards those goals. So I think what parents can do is really not put any of that additional pressure on, but just be there to support them in whatever way works. Of course, you all know your students well.
Yeah, definitely. That's such a good point.
This was a very great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Cassandra from Achievable with Kathy Hart. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT, SAT, and CLT courses at achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off.